Good evening. My name's Amelia Gentleman. I'm a journalist at The Guardian, and for the past few years I've spent more time than I like to remember writing about the Home Office and the various scandals that the department has presided over. A lot of the time reporting on this area can feel like a very negative, very depressing exercise. So I'm really excited to be here today and to be asked to come and attend such an incredibly positive and life-affirming occasion. It's a real privilege to be here hosting this very special Refugee Tales evening. Refugee Tales is a charity that I've admired from afar for a long time. I'm sure that most of you know quite a bit about what the organisation does. But for those who don't, a few words about the charity and why today's occasion is so incredibly important. The project has grown out of the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group, an organisation which visits detainees in immigration removal centres around the country. Volunteers offer the hands of friendships to people who are often lonely, scared, traumatised, people who've sometimes been the victims of torture, and people who are usually seeking asylum in this country. People who, for whatever reason, have seen that asylum claim turned down. The charity advocates for them, but isn't allowed to give legal advice. Instead, as well as solidarity and friendship, it supplies some practical things: phone cards, clothes, food for those people who have been released but whose immigration status remains somewhat uncertain. I'd like to share some key facts about why everybody here is so concerned about the immigration detention picture in the UK. The UK is the only country in Europe that detains people indefinitely for immigration purposes. Sometimes people are detained for days, sometimes for weeks, often for months, sometimes for years. I think I'm right in saying that 9 years has been the longest period that someone has been detained under immigration detention. And it's really important to highlight that this detention is very often completely pointless. Over half of those people who are detained are later released back into the UK. They aren't removed from the country, and their separation from their family, from their loved ones, has been entirely pointless. Around 24,000 people a year are detained in immigration removal centres around the country, and it's a very expensive process. Refugee Tales, as most of you will know, is campaigning for a future without detention and without the hostile environment that is currently threatening people with removal to Rwanda. Every year, the organisation uses a Canterbury Tales model of walking and sharing tales across the course of a pilgrimage, and this is day one. I'm really glad to be here, and congratulations for what you've done today. I wish I could have been there with you, and next year, the year after, I really want to join this walk. It sounds amazing. Every day, you will be hearing the stories of people who've been held in immigration detention. And tonight, we're going to have readings from JB, from writer Tessa McWatt, and we're also going to be hearing music from pianist Margaret Fingerhut. But before we start, I wanted to talk a little bit about how my knowledge of Britain's very flawed immigration detention system has developed over the past 4 years. In the autumn of 2017, I had an email from a refugee charity, the Wolverhampton Refugee and Migrant Centre. And one of the workers there, somebody I'd met a few years previously, emailed saying that they were very, very worried about the recent arrest of somebody who they'd been trying to help for, by that point, I think, 2 years. This was a woman called Paulette Wilson, who was then 61. She was a grandmother. She was somebody who had arrived in Britain in 1968, aged 10, and who'd lived in Britain without leaving the country once for 50 years. The charity was very, very concerned because they couldn't understand why Paulette had been arrested twice by the Home Office and why she was being held at that point in Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre, which many of you will know is one of the most notorious immigration removal centres for women, has a very, very troubled reputation. The email to me set out that she was somebody who had been in primary school in Britain, secondary school in Britain, had a daughter, had helped bring up her granddaughter, had lived an entirely law-abiding life, and had spent a number of years working in the House of Commons as a canteen worker for MPs. But she had begun to receive these letters from the Home Office telling her that she was here illegally and that she needed to be arrested and removed back to Jamaica. So it was a really, really puzzling email to receive. Luckily, she was helped to be removed from Yarlswood back home before her immigration flight took off, with the really, really critical help of this charity and with the assistance of her MP. And I went to interview her for The Guardian because it felt like the Home Office had made a really stupid and horrific mistake in her situation. We published a piece in The Guardian, and within hours of it being on our website, I began to get calls and emails from other people who had been similarly mistreated by the Home Office. I went to visit a couple of days later a man called Anthony Bryan, who, like Paulette, had arrived in this country as a young boy, I think at around the age of 8, from Jamaica, had lived a lifetime in the UK, entirely law-abiding life, and like Paulette, had been very shocked to be arrested by immigration enforcement officers just as he was approaching retirement age. He had spent 5 weeks in immigration detention by the time I met him, and he'd also been slated for removal back to Jamaica, a country he hadn't visited in half a century. This story was something that The Guardian reported on over the course of 6 months, and gradually it became clear that a catastrophic combination of immigration legislation from the 20th century and the new hostile environment policies from 2012 onwards had meant that people without clear documentation were being very, very mistreated by the Home Office. Eventually, it became clear that thousands of people had been misclassified by government officials as illegal immigrants, with really, really catastrophic consequences. Some of them lost their jobs, some of them became homeless because they were evicted. Others were denied healthcare, were denied pensions, were denied the right to travel. And I think, and as we now know, in the end, the government apologised, promised to institute wholesale reform of the Home Office, and the Home Secretary resigned. Looking back at this still very unresolved scandal, I think one of the things that I find most shocking is how the people who were wrongly detained by the Home Office in immigration removal centres tried repeatedly to tell the Home Office that they were legal residents, that they shouldn't have been arrested, they shouldn't have been detained, and that they were wrongly being held. But their voices were ignored. And I think that that's why what you're doing with this walk and what the Refugee Tales objective, why it's so important. We know that not many people listen to immigration detainees. Often they're made to feel voiceless, often they are made to feel completely invisible. That in a nutshell is why I'm so thrilled to be here and to see the enterprise that you are all embarking on today, which feels both like a statement of solidarity, but also quite a potent gesture of protest. And that's also why it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our first speaker, JB. JB, I think I'm right in saying, has been granted asylum, finally, here in the UK, temporary asylum, for 5 years. He's originally from Uganda, a country that he hopes to return to at some point when the dust settles. Since receiving asylum, he has become a fully qualified plumber and electrician, steps that have helped to start him building an independent new life here. And he's going to read us the Advocate's Tale. Please welcome JB.
Before I even start, thank you very much, as I've been introduced. My name is JB. I originally come from Uganda. Our little village is made up of citizens who are around. Our little village is made up of citizens who are proud for having witnessed how the village evolved from the prolific early days of King Mwanga's reign to the present. Our village is full of history, especially well known as a place where King Mwanga used to kill those who rebelled against him by crucifying them on a huge tree. Historic monuments for these acts, such as the big tree, still exist up to now, where these people were crucified. I come from a family of 5, and I am the firstborn. Our family was very humble and respected in our village because of the discipline we carried with us just at a very young age. The drama in our family started in 2000 after the divorce of my parents, when I was just at the age of 13 years old. One day our father left our family and never came back after having some misunderstandings with our mother. Our mother had not had much education, which meant that she could not get a job for our survival. Life became exceedingly hard, as things like going to school was a luxury. And it was at this point that I told my mom that I was off to look for a job. She sought, but surprisingly she nodded, which meant that she really wanted me to. At the age of 13, the best job job I could find was a car washer in a town just next to Kampala Central, the capital city. It was hard for me to compete with the big men, fellow car washers, as they had been there for a long time, and the customers knew them. The solution for this was to befriend them and share job lots on the same car, like washing the tires and wheels. And I was tipped after the payment was made. But I could not get much out of it to be able to support my family. At this point, I felt that I had disappointed my mother, my brothers and sisters, whom I promised to do my best to support, to put food on their plates. After breaking my promise, I didn't feel that I deserved to be home anymore. I found myself in the streets of Kampala near Queen Elizabeth's monument. But what I saw on the streets was another saga of a song, as you could not own anything of your own. Everything you had, all that was given to you by people, you had to address it to the chief, the leader of the street people. And if it looked attractive to him, then it was automatically his. Let it be food, money, watch, phone, the clothes you wear, all could be taken away from you if the leader of the street wanted them. I was asked to remove my fitting red t-shirt and the pair of jeans I came with and hand them over to the chief because he liked them. He gave me a stripped, dirty brown shirt and a pair of black trousers, which were huge compared to my size then. And while he grinned, he said, "Ha, now you're a beggar, my friend. Beggars don't look like they are going to the office." After 6 days on the street, I recall it was a Sunday. A white van with the word missionaries in blue paint written on it came by. Everyone ran towards where it stopped, a few inches from where I was sleeping. While I was staring at every one of the street kids, men and women, squeezing and fighting themselves through to get something to eat, as given by the missionaries, one brother dressed in a white cassock and a blue sash around his waist made his way through to bring food to this weak boy beside me. After giving the food to the boy, he asked us where we were both from, and I told him the name of my little village. His eyes widely opened, and he said, "We just got a land in that village. And as we speak now, we are building our monastery, where we will finally reside. Do you want to come with us? I will take you back home," he said. I replied that I didn't want to go back home because we have no help there. He said, "Don't worry, we will do our best to look after you and your family." On mentioning the help to my family, before he knew it, I was on the top of the van. As you know me, of course. That is how I got off the streets. When I got to the monastery with agreed terms, I would do what I could through my own jobs to support my family. Whatever we wanted, like school fees, I would contribute what I could afford, and the missionaries contributed the balance for me and my brothers and sisters. Thanks to the missionaries for saving my future, my relationship with them grew stronger through the years. By 2005, I had turned 18 years of age, and with this progress made with my life and my family, the missionaries asked me to start a youth group which could help young men just like me who were in the same or similar situations. Since I had the experience from my past life, I said yes, why not? That marked the birth of a youth group alongside the missionaries, which was later registered as a community-based organization. The main aim was to fight for people's human rights and to fight poverty. This group was formed with an intention of focusing mainly on youth. By getting involved in the work of serving young people, we realized that there were many people who were more desperate. So we decided to extend our services to other areas. And by the end of 2010, our group had stretched to many schools around the society. After succeeding, we therefore decided to get branches in some other districts of Uganda to be able to bring services nearer to the people. These places include Masaka district, Mbarara, Mpigi, and Mitiana district. As a pioneer and a leader of this group, I had a burning desire to think even more about the pressing needs which could be affecting society, especially where I come from. As I dedicated team, we moved on with building houses for those who were badly affected by floods caused by dangerous heavy rains. Extended our relationships to more schools through offering advice to young people and their common problems, giving financial assistance by setting up small-scale businesses, helping young people in seeking medical services by linking them to health centers, organizing outings to beaches and retreats purposely for quality of life, rewarding teachers in different schools to enable them perform even better, organizing parties and trainings for those who had finished their secondary level and were joining university. We committed ourselves to serve mainly young people through the activities mentioned above, and by giving advice about the most common problems of young people like early pregnancies. We also held discussions about HIV and AIDS and distributed condoms. One of the common problems we heard about were the young people who died silently because people would not speak about homosexuality. As some of you know, in Uganda, it's illegal. To be honest, I was confused about what to do because I knew that it was dangerous to be gay and also to help people out who would put your life in danger. But I learned how difficult it was to live in a community where people were rejected, denied jobs, discriminated against, cast by their own families, jailed, and worst of all, killed. Many people came to me in search of safe medical care and assistance, and some were in shock after their partners were killed. They never trusted anyone, and during the time I worked with them, they kept changing names and locations in fear of others tracking them down. As a youth leader, one of my main goals was to fight for human rights and equality. Most of all, it meant fighting against those who violated the human rights of these young men and women. But this meant a lot of sacrifice, of course, like being ready to be judged and facing the same measures of suffering they passed through. Me and my group acquired some training in Kenya, and on our return home, we were full of enthusiasm to act in protection of human rights of young people. We were attacked on many occasions and even injured sometimes. Many of my teammates could not cope with such dangerous risks and threats every day about losing their lives, so they quit. Due to the rapid fall of the number of my members, it was like pulling the plug out of the sink because we had a big area to cover and yet we were a handful of us left on the team. We started facing terrible threatening letters from both the people and the authorities. One day, it was a Wednesday, a bright sunny morning, around 8 a.m., as far as I remember. My friend, call him S, came for me from home because he needed a recommendation letter from me to allow him to apply for a passport. S was gay, and a couple of people knew it from where I come from. On the walk from the center with S, while chatting, we had people yelling behind us, "Rwanda yote mtuona, chimala chimala," meaning, "Today you will not survive, enough is enough." On looking behind us, it was a group of men, around 15 approximately in number, armed with big sticks and stones. Others jumped on trees to reach out for branches which I assumed they wanted to use for beating. Immediately I shouted to S that he should run, but it was too late for him to run fast enough. As I approached him, two men, one armed with a piece of metal, hit me on the forehead. I continued running up to the Teenage Center Hospital, where I felt safe enough as I knew the workers at the hospital. On reaching the hospital, the doctors said, "KB, you are bleeding too much. Lie down straight and relax. What happened? Accident?" I told them that I had been beaten by the angry men, but they were not to tell anyone that I was there. After the attack, I was advised by a friend who is a retired officer not to dare go to the police because this was a social issue, which first of all had to be dealt with the local council, and my relationship with the local council at this stage was not good. S was declared dead on the 3rd of August 2011 due to internal bleeding. He died at his home, and his parents were convinced that he had no chances of living after the terrible beating. When I tried calling his number, his sister received the call and warned me never to step a foot at their home again, as they were angry at me. Soon after that, I was given assistance from the missionaries to leave the country to escape here to the UK. On the 25th of June 2014, I received the news via email that a mob had demolished my house and stolen everything. No one was hurt, thank God. But the person in the email said that they were looking for me mainly. It is assumed that they thought I was still in Uganda by then. But when I first came to the UK, it was my intention of passing some time here, hoping that the pressure which had mounted at home would calm down after some time. And that time would come when it felt safe enough for me to go back to Uganda. It was not in my plans to seek asylum, of course, when I first moved to the United Kingdom, even though I was in fear of being persecuted. I thought things would get better with time, and when it was safe enough, I could go back to Uganda. It was also a question of not seeing my family for at least 5 years if I decided to claim asylum, which I did not want because I am very close to my family. It is because of these reasons that it took time for me to take a big step and make a decision of applying for asylum. After the demolition of our house especially, and after the statement that those who attacked the house were mainly looking for me, I was recognized here as a refugee in 2015. I arrived in the UK in 2012, and I was detained on the very day I applied for asylum, without being given a clear reason why, and without being told how long I would be held for. All they told me was, "We are taking you to a safe place where we shall work on your case very fast." Of course, as I later found out, none of that was the case. But I was yet to face something worse than the persecution I was running from back in my home country. Life in detention became life in detention became the worst experience of my life. Since I was released from detention, I make it my business to fight for my brothers and sisters who are stuck in detention with whatever little means I can. Not because I also passed through the same situation, not because it is the right thing to do, not because the whole system has failed us rather than helping, and indeed not because it's a waste of taxpayers' money, but simply because, as an asylum seeker, detention is the worst place I have ever been in my life. Especially when I needed help the most. It gives me nightmares knowing that another person has to go through the same experiences every day. But I believe we could put an end to this, and this can only be achieved by putting an end to indefinite detention. Put yourself in the shoes of those people fleeing their home countries, seeking for refuge here in the UK or in neighboring countries. Once you make it here, you would expect to get some sort of help or sort of protection, right? Well, in my case, it was the opposite. My experience in detention was worse than I can describe. We were held under Class B high security, locked in prison cells for long hours, treated as criminals, and sometimes even worse. For an extremely vulnerable person seeking refuge from persecution in his own country, this becomes a form of torture itself. I remember a young man in the cell opposite mine who used to cry out in pain to the officers every day and night. "Please, officer, please take me to the hospital, or at least give me some medication. I am dying." But all his crying fell on deaf ears. One day, when his cellmate rushed out of the cell in panic that he was actually dying, we had to go on strike so that he could get the attention he so badly needed. When he was eventually rushed to the hospital, after he could not talk anymore, we were eager to find out what had happened to him, whether he was still alive or not. But we never heard a thing from him ever since. In shock, one of the committed men on our wing who shared a wing with us said that sort of behavior from the staff was not even common in the prison where he served his sentence. Winning your case in detention in the fast-track system was close to impossible, as the great majority of the asylum cases were rejected, and so was mine. This didn't surprise me because it seemed to me that the entire structure of fast-track system itself was planned to result in refusal of asylum claims, rather than a fair judgment in the vulnerable cases. Even though every solicitor who saw my case argued that I had a very strong case, I only managed to fight my case and be granted asylum after I was released. Seeking medical help was a waste of time, because we only had one doctor on each wing, who seemed to only ever prescribe paracetamol. After suffering from diarrhea 2 consecutive times, I went to the doctor and asked him why I was denied medication even though it was prescribed to me. This is what he had to say. We fear people could take an overdose. Sorry, I can't give it to you. But then I wasn't even allowed to take it in his presence either. So I wondered why he was there in the first place. Eating anything was only possible with a really strong motivation to try to eat. Not because we didn't want to eat, but because we were so depressed and traumatized by the whole situation in detention. Most of us went on hunger strike to express our grief and dissatisfaction at the way we were being treated, and also to protest about being detained in the first place. Having to witness people attempting suicide is in itself a form of torture, leaving you hopeless and helpless to have the mental capacity to fight your own case. It really feels as if there is a deliberate attempt to push your mental capacity. This is only to mention a few aspects of detention. But someone today might ask, has the situation actually changed for the better? I guess the answer to the golden question is no. These things still happen today in detention. And this is where we come on to call for an end to detention. I hope we can see a better tomorrow and make a change once and for all by putting an end to indefinite detention. Thank you.
Thank you, JB, for that incredibly powerful and chilling account. I found it very, very disturbing to hear so many aspects of that account, but I think particularly your conclusion that the entire experience of being within immigration detention is set up to make your asylum claim fail. Really, really upsetting to hear that, and it really underlines how important it is to have accounts like yours out in the open. I'm really sorry that we don't have the Home Secretary, the immigration ministers in the room to hear that story, but perhaps that's something that Anna can organise at a later stage. It gives me great pleasure next to introduce Margaret Fingerhand. Margaret is an acclaimed concert soloist who's appeared with the London Symphony Orchestra, the London Philharmonic Orchestra, the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, a very, very long list of the most highly recognised orchestras around the world. You will hear her on Radio 3, Classic FM, again, radio stations globally. But I think, as well as being an incredibly talented pianist, it's particularly good to have her here this evening because she is a loyal and long-standing supporter of refugee and asylum causes. And I think I'm right in saying that during lockdown, she organised a fundraising exercise of gala live streaming concerts, which eventually saw her raise £88,000 for refugee charities which represents £1,000 for every key on the keyboard of the piano. Margaret will introduce the music that she's going to perform.
Thank you. This is a huge pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be playing 2 sets of pieces for you, ranging from all around the world, some of which have a connection to the composers, to the theme of migration. So basically there's going to be pieces by Grieg, Liszt, Bartók, and then in the second set I'm going to be playing Albanith, and then a Ukrainian composer, Sergei Volkovits, before finishing off with some Piazzolla tangos. I thought it would be a very appropriate way to start with a couple of short pieces by the Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. Because the first one is called Solitary Traveller. I know you're not solitary at the moment, but I think in reflection of those that do make difficult solitary journeys, it's a very charming, sweet little piece. And then I'm going to follow that with March of the Dwarves, in the hope that your march won't be quite as frenetic as that piece. Of course, Grieg is a wonderful composer, but in addition to that, what makes it very meaningful for me is he was a very great humanist as well. He cancelled a concert tour he was due to do in France as a protest for the Dreyfus affair in 1899. He wrote an article in which he hoped that the French would get back to the spirit of the French Republic in 1789, when it declared that it would defend basic human rights. And for that he got into some very hot water and received a lot of hate mail, not emails, but Twitter, but actually hate mail as a result of his stance about the situation. Anyway, 2 pieces by Grieg, the Solitary Traveller and Dance of the Dwarves. nowhere and be absolutely made for, and that's Franz Liszt. He was a ruthless cosmopolitan, shock horror, because he roamed around Europe, originally from Hungary, but he lived and visited all over France, Italy, Switzerland, sometimes in the company of a mistress, to add to the general's whiff of scandal. But he was he was like a mega pop star of his day. And he captured all his wanderings in 3 books of pieces, all the impressions of the places. And the 3 books, he called them Les Années de Pèlerinage, his years of pilgrimage. And I'm going to play you one piece from the first book, which has pieces all from his stay in Switzerland. And it's called Les Cloches de Genève, the Bells of Geneva. It's a very beautiful nocturne. You hear the very distant bells, and then this gorgeous melody that comes out of it. It's a very warm, happy piece, because in fact he wrote it to celebrate the birth of his daughter in 1835. circumstances to Liszt. Liszt was free to come and go as he pleased. In fact, a lovely story that there was some devastating floods in Hungary, and Liszt returned to give a series of fundraising concerts for flood victims. I said this was the equivalent of a superstar status, that he went and he raised a lot of money. Anyway, 100 years later, his compatriot Bela Bartok was forced to leave because of his anti-fascist views, and of course the rise of Nazism in the Second World War. And by 1940 it became intolerable for him, so he fled to America, where he eventually, after 5 years, he was able to take out citizenship there, although he sadly died shortly thereafter. But he was never happy in the States. He, of course, yearned to go back. He just never really settled. He didn't really compose very much there either. The set of pieces I'm going to play, for those of you that are not familiar with his music, hopefully you're in for a treat. He, very early on, became interested in ethnomusicology, and he went with a fellow composer starting about 1905, and they travelled all around Transylvania, what's now Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, then of course was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he had a wax and Edison wax cylinders, and he collected the folk songs, the folk tunes, the folk dances, from all over the region. Now, he did so from a very, he felt great empathy for these people. He did so with the best of intentions, and actually, you have to say that without his, if you like, we might look on it as cultural appropriation today, but without him doing that, all these thousands of melodies would probably then have been hidden, they might have disappeared. So he provided a vital record, and he likened them, when he put them, mounted them like a precious jewel with his own style, very individual style. I'm going to play one of his most popular sets, 6 very short Romanian dances from the Transylvanian regions. This is Bartok, 6 Romanian dances.
tomorrow as you embark on some of the toughest bit of your walk. Agala tomorrow is a 15-mile day with quite a lot of hilly terrain, so with any luck, some of the march music that we heard at the beginning will keep you going. It is my great pleasure to introduce next Tessa McWatt. Tessa is the author of 7 novels and 2 books for young people. She has been on multiple occasions nominated for prizes for her writing, and she's currently creative writing professor at the University of East Anglia. She also is a long-term supporter of Refugee Tales and is going to read for us the host's tale. Tessa.
Hello, and thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I really want to thank David and Anna for inviting me to be part of this amazing project. I want to thank you all for the company on the amazing walk today, the spectacular walk, especially the purple group. And I'd like to thank Oliver, who accompanied me to meet and talk with the delightful Yosef, about whom you'll hear in the host's tale. Asida, Tagalia, Gorasa, Kajak. I practice saying the names of these foods so that I will not appear ignorant for our meeting. I arrive early to the restaurant on Edgware Road. The server greets me. She is wearing a Sudanese toque, her head covered, her eyes bright. I ask her for a menu, but she hesitates. Only after she lays it on the table do I realize the source of her hesitation. The menu is in Arabic. I tell her that I'm waiting for someone who will know how to order for us. She smiles. Yes, good, he will, she says. Asida, Tagalia, Gorasa, Kajak, I say silently. I have a few minutes before Yusef arrives, and so I check the news on my phone. More than 20 days into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The resistance continues. The Ukrainian army has killed another Russian general. But, as the United Nations confirms, more than 3 million people have fled the country. I click out of the news quickly and get ready to record my conversation with Yusuf, whom I see crossing the road. He enters the restaurant, and his bright orange jumper and cheerful face make me smile. He is given a lift to this grey West London day with news of war, the ongoing pandemic, and our climate crisis. Yusuf left West Sudan in 2016 when he was 19 years old to escape racial persecution. His family are from a small town near Khartoum, where the Blue Nile and the White Nile converge, bringing people from many parts of Africa. Moving from his hometown to the capital, he sought to build a more prosperous future for himself, but he experienced the racism of the Arabic tribes who hold power in the country towards the subordinated African tribes. There, if you are from one of the African tribes, he told me the first time we met, they treat you like a slave. They look at you as though you were not a human being. A few months into working in Khartoum, he was arrested and wrongly accused of supporting rebels who were calling for the removal from office of Omar al-Bashir, the authoritarian president. Yusuf's employer was a man involved with the rebels, and through this association, he was detained and questioned about rebel activity. He was taken to prison where he endured abuse and torture over the course of a month. His captors pressed him for information on the source of the rebels' finances, of which he knew nothing, but they continued to torture him. For 3 days he had no food or water. It was like death, he told me. Finally, towards the end of the month, and in his ability to endure this death, he falsely promised them that he would bring them information. They forced him to sign a letter admitting to his guilt by association and then allowing him to leave prison under the condition that he provide them with what they had asked for. He consulted with a friend, a solicitor, about what he should do. He was advised to flee. There was no hope for anyone who had an issue with the government. No trial, no judge, no chance for justice. He had no choice. He was smuggled from Sudan to Libya in a 4x4 through the desert, 15 men in one vehicle, and 3 days through the desert to the mountains, where they were finally deposited in Kufra, and where smugglers demanded $2,000 from each of them. Some of the men were able to pay, but Yusuf was not. He was sold to another smuggler who took him to Tripoli, where he was forced to work off his debt by making bricks in a factory. Not allowed to leave the factory premises, he worked, ate, and slept in the factory compound, along with Cameroonians, Chadians, Egyptians, and other Sudanese, a miniature African continent, who were all working to pay off their debt to smugglers. His existence for a whole year was comprised of working without pay, making blocks, living and eating in a small factory where some of the men who had become ill, who had been deprived of anything humane, died right in front of him. One day it was all too much. He knew that if he was going to die, he would prefer to be back in Sudan. He refused to work. "If you want to kill me, I will not do any more," he told the smuggler. Afraid that Yusuf's attitude would spark a rebellion amongst the others, the smuggler offered to send him to Europe. "Welcome, Tessa," he says now, as he takes his seat at the table at the Sudanese restaurant. "I'm hungry," I say, "for something other than oily potatoes." He laughs. It's a joke between us from the first time we met at the British Library, where the idea for meeting at this restaurant first arose. Oily potatoes were a recurring theme, a recurring image in his recounting of his time in England so far. We spoke a lot about food, about what he was given the moment he arrived in the UK, hot chocolate, and what he eats now at the hotel in Hounslow, where he's housed among other asylum seekers. The cooks know him after all this time, and they leave out the oily potatoes from his servings, offering him plain pasta instead. Yusuf speaks to the waitress to let her know I haven't had Sudanese food before. He turns his attention back to our conversation, and I learn that there aren't a lot of Sudanese restaurants in London because many immigrants from Sudan are professionals and have a different attitude to working in a restaurant, which they don't see as a job. Sharing Sudanese food means celebrating with family and friends. Yusuf's father, who sells tobacco and coffee beans, wants him to be a professional, a doctor or something nice. But Yusuf says he wants a simple, good life. He thinks he might like to be a chef. Maybe he will open a restaurant. He describes the hospitality of Sudanese people, everyone eating together, meals shared with all, and the fact that strangers and foreigners are welcome. In contrast, at the hotel in Hounslow, he cannot share food with the other asylum seekers waiting for their papers. He has to take his food to his room to eat alone. He doesn't understand how people don't get sick from the food he has been offered while waiting for his claim to be processed. He visits friends when he can, and together they eat Sudanese food, the traditional asida, tagalia, or garasa. If you eat the food they give you in detention, so oily, maybe you will lose your health, he says. He orders for us, and soon we are served garasa, a doughy flatbread enveloping stewed meat. We tear off sections to eat with our hands. His intention was never to come to Europe, but simply to escape Sudan. He thought Libya would be better, but it was worse, and now he was headed to Europe via Libyan smugglers. He arrived by boat in Lampedusa and was forced, beaten, into being fingerprinted in order to be fed and given shelter. After 3 weeks in the camp, he learned of a friend who had been sent back to Sudan by the Italian government and had not been heard of since. Fearing for his own safety, Yusuf fled Italy and found his way to the coast, then onto a train from Ventimiglia to Marseille. A French family hid him under the seats of their compartment as they crossed the border into France. It felt like a relief, but only briefly. Now a tall young man enters the restaurant, and we are interrupted as he approaches our table, and Yosef stands to greet him. They tap shoulders, then what would normally be a handshake is a wrist pump because Yosef is in the middle of eating. He introduces me to the man, and I do a similar wrist pump. While Yosef talks to him, I glance at the news on my phone again. A Nigerian man trying to get into Poland from Ukraine said border staff told him they were not tending to Africans. We've been chased back. We've been hit by police armed with sticks, he told the BBC. There have also been numerous reports of Ukrainian security officials preventing Africans from catching buses and trains going to the border. When Yosef sits back down, he tells me that he met this tall man in Calais when he was first sent there after his asylum claim had been rejected because he had been fingerprinted in Italy and not France. In the Calais jungle, he says, we lived together like brothers, eating together, keeping one another alive. In the jungle, desperate not to be returned to Italy and in all likelihood Sudan, Yosef joined 11 other men who planned to get to the UK. They acquired an inflatable dinghy and paid for a motor that was brought to them by the French girlfriend of one of the men. On a pre-dawn morning in June 2020, while the first COVID-19 lockdown was still in place, the 12 men took off in darkness towards Dover, with only one of them, a man who had a heart problem, wearing a life jacket. After an hour on the channel, the dinghy began to lose air, and at times, its edges tipped below the surface of the water, which started to fill the floor of the boat. Their only bailing tool was a small cup, which they filled and emptied at the greatest possible speed. The man in the life jacket became ill. Towards the 4th hour on the water, as the sun rose on the horizon and the water rose towards their legs, they became desperate, and one of the men called the border force. Au secours, they yelled, afraid the dinghy would soon be flat. Yosef was in disbelief. Would all he had gone through end here by drowning in the channel? Because he could speak French and a bit of English, he was able to speak to the border police and describe what was happening to them. They were rescued, none of them ending up in the water, but the man in the life jacket died soon after they landed. The British border force took them to Dover for 2 days and then to the same hotel where he is now. Hot chocolate, fish and chips. After 2 days, he was moved to York into the Mercure Hotel. With the COVID lockdown closing most hotels, but opening some for unhoused people and asylum seekers, the Mercure was a refuge, where the staff were paid by the government to look after their asylum guests, where the hospitality of a hotel was offered to the over 100 refugees in their own rooms. While they weren't allowed to eat together due to COVID restrictions, refugees were asked what kind of food they wanted. The other refugees were kind, good-natured. This place was welcoming, not hostile. But, as we know, lockdown kindnesses were exceptions to normal, and they were fleeting. After 6 months, when funding for the hospitality ran out, Yosef was moved to accommodation in Sheffield, a shared house, where he was told he would be allowed to apply for asylum. 2 weeks later, however, the Home Office came to take him to a detention center. Because he had been fingerprinted in a country before he arrived in the UK, Yosef was now being threatened with deportation. After 1 day in prison, he was taken to Brook House Detention Center near Gatwick. He was in despair. Many of the people around him had given up. Some had severe mental illness. A few tried to die by suicide. We sit in silence for a few minutes, illness and death circling my thoughts, before I try to break the mood. When I ask him what they fed him, he smiles. Oily potatoes. But then he gets serious again. I cannot say it's rubbish because it's a blessing, he says, but he adds that he doesn't think that I'd like them either. Detention was like jail. A mattress, a small toilet in the corner, a TV. Small windows in the doors allowed him to see the men, some in uniforms, others being brought to stay, walking past his room. Some people think the UK is a heaven, he says. I want people to know that we do not come here without giving up so much at home. We come here because we have no choice. At 9 p.m. in detention, they lock the doors. In the night, there are prolonged screams from those who are being taken away for deportation. Life is still life, he says. When Yosef's lawyer listened to the details of his journey and understood that he'd been trafficked in Libya, a small window of hope opened. This would be the foundation of his case to remain in the UK. And finally, he was released from detention and moved to this current hotel, a temporary stop until he hears from the Home Office. He has been waiting to hear from the Home Office for nearly 2 years. Lockdown compassion has disappeared behind the primacy of market forces. The hotel in Hounslow has opened up post-COVID and has welcomed travelers from all over the world, but the hospitality towards refugees has been curtailed. Yosef sometimes thinks he won't get to stay. And what would you like to do if you stay? I ask. I would like to work in immigration to help other people, he says, or in another charity, the best way to learn English. And cook? Yes, I'm a good cook, he says. Why do you want me to tell your story? I ask. My idea likes yours, he says. People think that refugees come here just to steal jobs, but they would not come if they did not have a really strong reason to risk life. What you do for me is really something great, and if you are really honest with what you do, believe me, it helps. The tall man who greeted us with the tapping of wrists walks past our table and waves to us, a goodbye with great warmth. Our dessert arrives, pastries with pistachio and honey, and I ask Yosef a few more personal questions. He hopes to lead a normal life. If he lives in a small room and he's free, that's all he wants. He has qualifications in management and worked for a year with the Red Cross. He would like to do something similar here. One of his Calais brothers, who also came by boat, has already got his settlement papers, and Yosef came 3 months before him. There doesn't seem to be a system that's fair, he says. A lot of migrants are qualified and really want to give back. He shakes his head but smiles. You smile even at things that are difficult, I say. If I can compare Sudan and the UK, there is a very different way to welcome. He tells me that due to the position of Sudan in Africa, there are many people who go through it to get to Libya and Egypt. We have a lot of refugees in Sudan, he says. We don't think they come to take our life. If you come, you will be welcome. If you can't buy water, I will pay. If your car breaks down, you can stay with me for as long as you need. We welcome foreigners. When I ask him about racism in the UK, he admits that sometimes he's abused. A few people in the parking lot of his hotel in York accosted him while he was getting some fresh air. They filmed him trying to defend himself. He thinks it's silly to think about differences in skin color. In London, things are better, but he doesn't feel he belongs in a big city. He'd like to live in a smaller place. He loves to do sports, loves to be outside. I hope Putin will not finish everything, he says. We sit in silence again. I think about all that Yusuf's asylum claim rests on, a willing Home Office, the right timing, and perhaps a more unspoken kind of fortune. In more news today, an 11-year-old Ukrainian boy was treated to a hero's welcome in Slovakia this week when he crossed the border after traveling 1,000 kilometers alone, fleeing the war with Russia. His mother had sent him to safety, unable to leave herself. The boy came all alone with a plastic bag, passport, and a telephone number written on his hand, the Slovak embassy in the UK said. Officials praised him for his smile, fearlessness, and determination of a real hero. I think about the common root of host in the words hospitality and hostility. From the Latin hostis, for foreigner, stranger, or enemy. And I wonder when and why one becomes the other. While Yosef finishes his coffee, I get up to pay the bill for our lunch. The waitress who greeted me tells me that the man already paid it. I'm bewildered, embarrassed, wondering if Yosef confused my invitation to lunch with a request for him to host me for Sudanese food. I ask the waitress if there could be a mistake. She assures me the bill has been paid. When I return to the table, I chastise Yusuf for taking care of the bill when it should have been my offering as gratitude for his story. He looks surprised. He didn't pay, he says, and I tell him that what the waitress said. He gets up immediately to talk to her, and they have an in-depth conversation in Arabic. He comes back to the table. I wait for his explanation. My friend paid the bill, he says without ceremony. For a moment I'm confused, but then I realize that he means the friend who wrist-pumped us, the man with whom Yusuf shared food and sleep and anger and hope in the Calais jungle paid for our lunch. It takes me a few minutes to process all my conflicting thoughts. I stop the recording on my phone. I have no impulse to check the latest news, but I think about the 2 years since Yusuf arrived on the sinking dinghy. I must conjure words that will describe the experience of hearing his story, the etymologies of hostile and hospitality, or of stranger and estranged. It dawns on me that the word home is better described as an action, something to make, something to give, something to establish, to make available, an act of decency. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa, for that story, which was both profoundly moving, but also very anger-making. Thank you. We're going to have some more music now from Margaret.
When I was researching what repertoire to play for my refugee series that I did in 2019, I devised a program that was called Far From the Home I Love. And I thought I found the ideal candidate for the program with the Spanish composer Isaac Albéniz, because the story went. He ran away when he was 12 years old. He stowed away to sea from Spain to South America at the age of 12. So I thought, great, I'm going to mine that. Which is but then a little bit more investigation realized that only recently has that story been adjusted, because some sleuth went into the ship's log of the era and found out that actually his father had been on board at the same time. But still, it was a great story, and he did travel all over the place, obviously with his father. When he was just 12 years old, they went North America, South America. And when he finally returned home when he was back to Spain, he made a big study of the Spanish folk music. And I'm going to play you a wonderful example of it. It's called a secudillas, which is a very lively dance from Andalusia. So we're going out into the brilliant sunshine, which I hope you're going to get tomorrow. is by a Ukrainian composer, and one who had a very sad life story. He was born in 1877. His name was Sergei Bortkovits. He was born in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov, where he lived very happily with his family. And then he went, as a young man, he went to study in the St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music. And from then he went on to study in Berlin. And he settled in Berlin. And then along came the First World War, and being a Russian, he was kicked out of Berlin, and he went back to Ukraine. And then the Russian Revolution happened, and the communists came, and he was kicked out again. And he and his wife fled to Constantinople, where they eked out a very meagre existence, and finally he managed to go back to Austria. He got Austrian citizenship in 1925, and from there he went back to Berlin and was having a great career, and then of course what happened, the Nazis. So he got kicked out again, and this time he went back to Vienna, but he and his wife endured the most appalling conditions. All his music had been destroyed, he had no income. Finally, he was able to re-establish himself after the war, and he died in Vienna in 1952. So, very sad story of that era. He wrote some wonderful music, and the piece I'm going to play for you was inspired. It was written. He wrote it in about 1904. It was inspired by a visit to the mountains of the Crimea. And scenes from the countryside had inspired in him. And this piece is called Les Rochers d'Ouchkach. I'm not sure I pronounce that correctly. It basically translates as the high rocks, and it's a view of the awe-inspiring mountain scenery that forms the backdrop to the city of Alupka. And it's a very emotional, powerful piece of music. actually, he was born to immigrant Italian parents, and who then, shortly after he was born, they moved to Little Italy in New York City. When he was a young man, he returned to Argentina and started writing tangos. It seems incredible to us today, he was such a great figure, but he met with a very difficult reception there because he dared to mess with the tango. And the die-hard traditionalists didn't like the innovations that he was doing. There's an expression in Argentina, everything may change except the tango. And he even had a gun held to his head and death threats for daring to do what he did, which was to introduce what he called a nuevo tango. It took him a long, long time eventually to gain a reputation in his homeland. The tide eventually turned when he was nearly 50 years old by then, but he wrote maybe a tremendous work ethic. He wrote over about 3,000 pieces. And I'm going to play two of the most famous. The first one is Oblivion, which he wrote as a film score, I forget the name of the film, in 1984. And of course he died really quite recently, but he was given a hero's funeral in Argentina by then. And I'm going to finish with Liebe tango, a very famous tango. Piazzolla once, he often said that for him the tango was much more for the ear than for the feet, which is just as well, because I'm not going to attempt to dance, you want to see me do that. But I hope that the Liebe tango especially will kind of energize you for your dance long trek tomorrow.
I want to say thank you to all of our speakers, to Tessa McWatt, to JB, and again to Margaret Fingerhut. I have found this an incredibly inspirational and moving evening, but also an occasion that's made me feel very, very angry, not the music. I think from what we've heard from our two speakers, there are themes that come up a lot during the reporting that I do for The Guardian. I've heard about the delays that can leave people waiting for asylum decisions for 2 years. We've heard about an asylum system that is set up to deny asylum to those people who need it. We have heard about the inherent double standards in a refugee system that this year has seen us be encouraged to open our homes to people from Ukraine, whilst at the same time legislation has gone through Parliament which criminalises desperate, vulnerable people who try to seek sanctuary in this country, who come here by small boats. I suppose, in a way, feeling angry is sometimes a bit of an occupational hazard for me. I've been thinking about the many, many unmet promises that the government made in the wake of the Windrush scandal 4 years ago, and which will remain largely unmet. Priti Patel has promised a comprehensive reform of the Home Office, has promised to make it more compassionate, has promised to make the immigration system fairer. We're still waiting for much of that. The compensation system, the compensation fund promised to those people affected by the Windrush scandal has not been paid out to most people. Only 1 in 4 those people have applied, have received any money, and a really shameful number of people have died in the period between applying for compensation and receiving it, and amongst them was Paula Wilson. So I think there is a lot to feel ashamed of, but also I suppose sometimes when you're feeling all of this fury and shame, you can feel a bit powerless. And in an attempt to kind of end with something upbeat, I do think that kind of the experience I've had writing about these issues for The Guardian is positive, amplifying the voices of people affected by a lot of these difficulties in the Windrush situation really, really had a positive outcome. Legislation was changed and a lot of people's lives were transformed for the better. And that's why I think there's an enormous amount of power in what you're doing with Refugee Tales, both in getting the stories of those people who have had negative experiences in our asylum system out to other people, but also in the protest march or pilgrimage that you are undertaking. So it is a really brilliant thing to be here on your first night of your walk, and I hope that the rest of it goes very, very well. A few final bits of housekeeping. I want to remind you that copies of the Refugees' Tales are available at the back of the hall today, and I think they include both the accounts that you've heard this evening. If you've been moved by what you've heard, you may also like to donate to the work of the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. And there are also a number of volunteers from the organisation ready to talk to anybody who's thinking about perhaps volunteering, and they can give you an idea about what the experience of volunteering is like. Finally, I'd like to ask you to give one more round of applause to Tessa McWatt, JB, and Margaret Fingerhut. I've been asked to tell you that there is some kind of surprise organised now, just as you leave the auditorium.
So we're just going to do a little bit of singing for you, send you out with a little bit of singing. So you arrange yourselves. Sing twice.
Sing.
So, so guys, we're going to have...
Oh, you asked it.
Can you look at me?
Yes.
Hello? Part number 1. Part number 2. Part number 3. Part number 4. So we're going to sing this for you once, and then in the spirit of amplifying voices, we're going to do it a second time, and you are going to sing it. So this is us first, so pay attention. Refugee tales, solidarity.
Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee solidarity. Refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity.
Okay, you'll go. So, part number 1 here, part number 2, part number 3, and sort of from halfway, part number 4. So we're going to sing it once all together. We're going to sing it once all together, and then we're going to sing it, us and you, in parts. So part number 1, and then part number 2 is going to come in a little bit later. Part number 3 comes in a little bit later. Part number 4 a little bit later. Don't worry if you don't get it right. Just give it a go. So, all together then. So.
Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, solidarity. 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 Refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Refugee tales, solidarity. Hey!
can go.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Baptism of fire. Thank you.
In Trevorth Botanic Gardens. Hello. Hello.
Nauta o kiedy Trevorth
Salman Donkey is mga pa Trevorth.
أهلا وسهلا. نحن في Trevorth Gardens وشوال Wales.
Привіт, вас вітає Україна. Слава Україні!
Доброго здоров'я. We've all been walking along the wonderful North Wales coastal path under the umbrella of Refugee Tales Cymru in solidarity with the lovely walkers of Refugee Tales. So greetings to all of you, Anna, David, Marika, Steve, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful walk today and a great evening this evening, and we send you all our love in solidarity with asylum seekers and refugees everywhere, and with you. So bye from North Wales. Bye.